Hello, welcome to the webinar on enhanced engagement and metrics for responsible supply chains. I'm Cheryl Baldwin, and I'm the VP of Consulting for Pure Strategies, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Just quickly, Pure Strategies is a sustainability consulting firm that helps companies build and implement their sustainability programs. We've worked with companies like Walmart and Wrangler and Ben & Jerry's, and supply chain engagement's been important in our work with them because the largest environmental and social impact, as well as opportunity, often lies outside of the company's operations. So engaging upstream helps understand, encourage, and support progress on environmental and social topics. Plus, many customers are looking to understand the situation across the entire supply chain. So it's important to be able to effectively collect information from upstream partners. We're fortunate today to get to hear from 4 organizations that are at the forefront of this work: Wrangler, Campbell, the Sustainability Consortium, and SupplyShift. We will hear a short presentation from each of the presenters, and during that time, please type your questions into the webinar panel so that we can take them during the question and answer discussion after the presentations. So just real quick, before I turn it over to our first presenter, I thought I'd let you know about another event that might be of interest. Pure Strategies is holding a one-day in-person workshop on June 21st in Chicago on supply chain engagement. It's going to be focused on agricultural supply chains, and registration's open right now. There's an early registration discount available for the next few days until May 15th. And if you're interested, you can find information on our website, purestrategies.com. Now, let's get going. We'll kick off the presentations with our first speaker, Roian Atwood. He is the Director of Sustainability for Wrangler Jeanswear. I'll let Roian kick it off.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Let's advance the slides, and happy to be here with everybody and share a little bit about sort of our overall approach to engaging our supply chain and reducing the risk and responding to the responsibility that we have as a good corporate citizen. How do we advance the slides? Next slide, please. Hello. Next slide, please. Ed or Cheryl, or could you guys help me with the slide progression?
Yeah, Ed from Ethical Corp, if you're still available, I think you are going to be advancing the slides for each of the presenters. So if you could take us to Wrangler's first slide, that would be terrific.
Great, and let's just jump straight to the second one. Again, my name is Roian Atwood. I'm the Director of Sustainability, and we're here today to talk about metrics to engage our supply chains and how we respond in the most responsible fashion as good corporate citizens. Next slide. A little bit about Wrangler. We've been around since 1947. You might be familiar with the brand. We were emerged as the rodeo jean of choice, something that was unique to our brand is we switched the fell seams from the interior, from the interior to the exterior, so that someone riding in a saddle wouldn't have that chafing action. Today you see Wrangler represented in a wide variety of retail distribution channels, from bigger box retail to Western specialty, and we've been engaged heavily on supply chain engagement for at least 3 years, if not longer, under our parent company, VF Corp. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about some of the risks and from those risks, the responsibility that we're called to action, we see 3 big risks in our supply chain that are being talked about heavily right now. The need to, for us as a natural fibers, largely a natural fibers product line and company, the cotton that goes into a product. There's 2 things that sit out there, deep supply chain impacts that are super concerning to us. One is the loss of grasslands as it applies to our market, as you can imagine for some of the Western specialty to consumer. They live on the land and they relate to our grasslands, and we're losing roughly about 3% of our natural grasslands every year in the United States, which is challenging for the vocation of our primary consumer. But additionally, there's a concern out there about all of the impacts that agriculture has on the water systems and Gulf hypoxia leading down to the bottom of the Mississippi Delta. Next slide. In addition to agriculture, water stewardship is particularly important for our industry. Water stewardship, when we look at our industry as a whole, apparel as a whole, we see examples of ways that water is not being managed well in the supply chain. In Bangladesh, it's estimated that only 25% of the 400 textile mills in Bangladesh are treating their wastewater appropriately. And even in August of last year in Mumbai, of a dye stuff factory with a failed wastewater treatment system actually died 6 dogs, homeless dogs, blue. So they have a water issue and an animal cruelty issue, both. Next slide. In addition to agriculture, water, there's concerns from some of our stakeholders about our energy footprint globally, and some vocal campaigns from our friends from the nonprofit world that are sharing the importance and the urgency around addressing the decarbonization of our supply chain. So these three things, from agricultural to water to our energy footprint, are some of the elements deep within our supply chain that we are seeing are key risks and things that we need to be responsive to. Next slide. When we talk about engaging our suppliers, we simply break up our supply chain into 2 different categories: our tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, and our tier 3 suppliers. So for us, tier 1 would be a cut and sew facility. Tier 2 would be a fabric mill, and that would be a yarn and fabric mill construction. And tier 3 falls more into the ginning and farming side of things. And as you can see here, we're utilizing 2 different work streams in order to span the depth of our supply chain. We are heavily aligned with the Sustainability Consortium and the Field to Market. Those are the entities that help govern the KPI development in science. The Sustainability Consortium, we're members of both the Sustainability Consortium and Field to Market, and they both have different KPIs that arrive at some of the same conclusions and similar conclusions, but the tracking and measurement and the path to get there is slightly different. There's 13 KPIs, key performance indicators, for the clothing, footwear, and textiles that we respond to in the Sustainability Consortium. And there is a 6 sort of output metric dashboard under Field Print Calculator under the Field to Market platform that we use to gauge our overall success. We have some internal program management goals around soil and soil health that dovetail into the field print analysis, field print calculator, but that's sort of more internally managed. And none of this would be possible without our partners that have developed tools that make this process of gathering information more seamless and easy. So you can see here, SupplyShift for our tier 1, tier 2 is our primary tool partner, and MyFarm's on the tier 3. Next slide. It's really critical to mention that any sort of deep supply chain engagement and tracking and measuring these impacts and getting to what is our biggest risks is an internal process of collaboration. For me, myself, for the work that we do on the Wrangler side and the interconnection with our parent company, there are a wide variety of parties that we need to liaise with in order to make this work come to fruition, come to life. Everyone from our responsible sourcing team, our supply chain team, the compliance team, internal manufacturing, and of course we're driving the sort of the effort to get to data that can be analyzed, that can demonstrate performance, and ultimately we will report back internally, but also to our retail partners that value and see that it's important, and to the consumer on our website, and share what are our key goals that came out of this initiative, what are our findings, and how we're progressing. Next slide. When we engage suppliers, we do spend a lot of time on figuring out what is that best application, the digital delivery, the platform that it sits on, and how is it relevant around the globe, this pre-learning exercise, a training and survey, and not shying away from taking the opportunity to educate our supply chain and our suppliers on what we're actually seeing in the marketplace, what are the drivers that are relevant to us, and the KPIs that we're measuring against and how we treat their information. But it's not just this tracking and measurement process, it's an ongoing engagement. So with suppliers, whether we're taking their data and we're analyzing it from internal here, like a benchtop analysis, that wouldn't prevent us or stop us from being in continuous dialogue about the adoption of renewable energy and performing on-site locations at their facility and being further engaged on what's possible and being open to the idea of connecting that overall supplier performance with their sustainability performance and pushing the threshold on what's possible. Internally, the conversation can't end either. This supply chain engagement is only as valuable as what we share back out to our internal teams. We look at the data that's coming from the suppliers. We make strategic choices. In some cases, we've held design summits internally to set targets around materials and make those strategic choices that get us closer to those targets. And how do we empower our procurement teams, our merchandising, and our design teams to have regular communication and to have an ongoing engagement with suppliers and material vendors to get to those targets and goals that we've set. Next slide. When I mentioned that taking the time to educate suppliers, one recent example of that was Wrangler's recent publication over Earth Day, talking about healthy land stewardship practices in cotton growing. It was really critical for us to author this paper, to surmise the findings, and to really put forward what we saw as the most valuable practices from a cotton growing standpoint. This is sort of a precursory step for us to setting science-based targets, or especially around our Tier 3 ag impacts. But we didn't author anything new. This was published based upon 47 scientific papers, reviewed by the USDA, reviewed by the Nature Conservancy and the Soil Health Institute. And the value out of this was coming to certain conclusions that we could share with our suppliers, with our supply chain, and in some cases, our cotton growers deep within Tier 3. Next slide. Next slide. These are some of the key findings of the report. So as you can imagine, going through this effort to understand the impacts and the value of implementing the use of, say, cover crops, no tillage, precision planting, and crop rotation, we found that growers that are utilizing this practice in our Tier 3 can sequester or drive 3 times more carbon into soils using the soils as a carbon sink, as opposed to a conventional system, which, because of the exposure of soil to wind, rain, erosion, that we actually see soil lost. The data represented on the right-hand side of that slide is representative of what the best of the science has to offer in terms of the value of these practices from an environmental standpoint. We have the carbon sequestration rates for the 3 different practices. We have the water infiltration for 2 of the practices. We weren't able to dial in on for rotation. And then also the water retention for these 3 different practices as well, demonstrating to our suppliers and supply chain that these practices are the practices we would like to see emulated in our supply chain. And this is the reason why. And by addressing both carbon and water impacts, we're getting to greater resiliency in the supply chain. So moving from a process of engagement, tracking, and measurement, setting our targets and performance, and ultimately, if we can implement the way that we hope to, we're creating wins for all up and down the value chain, getting to a place of greater climate resiliency. So I believe that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Roian. We're going to just want to a reminder to the audience that please type your questions for the presenters as we go along. We'll collect those and have a question and answer session after all the presentations. So let's go to our next presenter, Niki King. She is the Director of Responsible Sourcing for Campbell Soup Company. Niki? Niki, you may be muted on your end. We can't hear you at this point.
Can't unmute. So I've got to click back. Bye.
Sorry about Niki, I don't know if that's something you can unmute yourself. You want to on your end so we can hear you? Sorry, folks. It looks like we're having just a quick issue here. So looks to be that Niki is muted on her end and also muted by the organizer. So we're looking to address that. So Niki, if you can go into the panel, unmute yourself. Looks like the organizer took care of their end, and then we can be able to hear your presentation. Here we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I was talking to myself for a little bit there. So Niki King, Director of Responsible Sourcing here at Campbell Soup Company. Been with the company about 10 years in a variety of sustainability roles. Most recently, about a year and a half ago, I moved into this role, which is a newly created position for the company focused on sustainability in our supply chain. So if you want to move to the next or the first slide. Yep, right there. So for us, we're not quite as far ahead as Wrangler, but in the past few years, we've seen a significant increase in the need to address supply chain sustainability risks and to be able to show our progress through data. So integrating this work into our overall corporate strategies has really been a journey that's starting to come to life for us. So nearly 10 years ago, when I first started here at the company and working on CSR efforts, we really were focused on environmental sustainability within our own operations and philanthropic efforts in our communities. Over the past few years, though, that really has changed. So in 2015, when I was in my previous role leading stakeholder engagement and sustainability reporting for the company, we conducted an in-depth stakeholder engagement exercise and materiality assessment to identify the issues most important to our stakeholders and to our business. So the things that really rose to the top at that point in time were responsible sourcing, sustainable agriculture, traceability, and transparency. And, as you know, all of those topics really were focused on our supplier base and really required deeper strategic partnerships with our suppliers. And then another thing that happened shortly after that is Campbell launched its Real Food philosophy, and one of the tenets of that philosophy declared that all of the food that we produce as a company should be done so using ethical and sustainable practices. So those insights really led to two things. One, the creation of my position here at the company, which is embedded in our global procurement office, and responsible sourcing became one of the key elements of our CSR strategic framework. So the slide that you currently see is our new strategic framework, which we launched in February in our new CSR report. So as you can see, it's really focused on 4 different areas, responsible sourcing being one of those, and under the grown pillar, our sustainable agriculture efforts as well. So responsible sourcing and sustainable agriculture, those are really partner tenants, and we work closely with our suppliers to make improvements in the supply chain. So you can go to the next slide. So something else that we were also managing was a multitude of questionnaires and assessments and frameworks that are relevant to sustainability. So, and most of these have supply chain elements, and we've really seen that those supply chain elements have grown in number. So we were responding to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, Carbon Disclosure Project. We were responding to the Walmart Sustainability Surveys. And we have really seen an increase in the push to collect responsible sourcing or supply sustainability data. So we really needed to get a handle on that. And one of the things that was always a struggle for us is when we were trying to respond to the Walmart sustainability surveys, it was a challenge for us to collect that data. So as we were building out our responsible sourcing strategies, we used some of these assessments and frameworks as our guidelines. And we worked very closely. We're members of TSC, and we worked really closely with the TSC to help identify the KPIs that we need to focus on. And most of these are within our agricultural ingredients. So you can go to the next slide. So the next thing that we did is we launched a set of responsible sourcing goals, and how we measure success against those goals really will be influenced by many of the assessments that you saw on the previous slide. So our primary goals are to responsibly source and identify full traceability of 16 primary raw materials by 2025. And as we were identifying these 16 raw materials, we used a lot of different methodology with risk assessments, and we also used the TSC hotspots to help do that as well. The one thing that we do know as we're rolling out these goals and really trying to get a handle on the baseline data is that tracking this data as well as the data needed for all the different frameworks will continue to be a challenge, but we are working to identify better solutions, such as partnering with SupplyShift. We currently don't have IT systems in place that allow us to do massive rollout of our program and to immediately track data. So we've used a simple phased approach. I won't go into a lot. You can go to the next slide, sorry. So this is our approach. It's very simple. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the way we're rolling out this programming is, first we had to set some expectations for our suppliers. We didn't want to be heavy-handed, but we set out a set of guidelines. We rolled that out to the suppliers of those 16 priority ingredients. So again, doing it in a phased approach. The next thing, and probably the most important thing, is really engaging with our suppliers. So we've done a couple of different things here. We have also, in our global procurement department, rolled out a new strategic supplier relationship program, and sustainability is an element of that program. So every time those suppliers come in to meet with us, we talk to them about sustainability and ask them to present to us on their efforts as well. We've also embedded it in all of our RFPs and our supplier contracts. And most recently, we've worked with our buyers to integrate sustainability into their category strategies globally. So the thing that we're working on now really is the third element of measuring performance. So the next few months for us will really be focused on outlining our baseline data. And we are putting together a supplier survey that will allow us to truly assess our suppliers' progress and be able to better respond to external assessments. And we'll have a couple of different surveys. As a matter of fact, our Sustainable Agriculture group, who we partner with, is pretty close to rolling that out to our agricultural suppliers. And that survey is very closely aligned with the TSC KPIs. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. As you can see, we're kind of at the beginning stages of our journey, and we really are looking forward to partnering with SupplyShift to see if they can help us solve some of our data dilemmas. And that's it for me.
Great, thanks so much, Niki. And just another reminder for folks on the line, if you have any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat feature so that we can have those for discussion later. So let's move on to our next presenter, Euan Murray. He's the CEO of the Sustainability Consortium. Euan?
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Cheryl. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Terrific. Excellent start. Right. Well, I will launch in. I guess the first thing worth saying is it's really great to hear from Roian and Niki. Wrangler and Campbell are both members of TSC, and it's always really fantastic to hear how our work is brought to life through the real world projects these guys are out there implementing. It probably gives a much better illustration than I'll be able to give, but I'll touch on some of the commonalities and some of the other things that we're doing here as we tackle this issue. For those of you that don't know TSC, we're a global nonprofit organization. Our mission is to use the best sustainability science to help companies make the everyday products that everyone uses better and more sustainable. And we have about 100 different members from the corporate space, civil society, NGOs, and the sustainability research community. And we've offices in the US, in Europe, and in China. So if we can have the next slide, please. Great. So this is sort of a more generic example, generic illustration of what we've just heard from Campbell's and Wrangler about their supply chain and how that works. And I guess what you see here, what we're trying to illustrate is the fact that firstly, supply chains across the board are typically long and complex with lots of different processes and lots of different organizations involved. And also we know that hotspots, social impacts and environmental impacts can really occur right across the value chain. And yet what we also see is that there's a point of concentration in the middle of the supply chain where everything sort of channels together. And that point of concentration is in retail, and in specifically where the merchants and buyers in retail organizations engage with the brands and their other tier one suppliers and talk about what goes on shelf and how it should get there and what should be included in it. And that conversation, that's globally a conversation between a relatively small number of people in the major retailers and the major brands and manufacturers, and that conversation is really what locks in a whole set of sustainability hotspots, but also that conversation can be used to unlock sustainability improvements by getting the right information in there and then creating the right incentives to send a market signal. So in our measurement and reporting program, we're really trying to harness that demand signal from retailers and brands and other major purchasers to increase the implementation of, firstly, sustainability assessments, but also more importantly, sustainability improvement projects right across the value chain. And we're now at the point where we have about $200 billion worth of consumer products managed using the tools that we've developed through retailers like Walmart and Kroger and Walgreens, and through many of our other members too. And we also now see that many of the products that are sold through these major food and consumer goods companies have been part of the Walmart Sustainability Index or other similar initiatives for multiple years. And for the first time, we're really now able to see in the real data how companies and in fact whole sectors are improving year on year, and of course where the next step of improvements should come. And so our focus to date really has been on that business interface between retailers and their major tier one suppliers and brands. And yet we know from the first two presentations, we know from the diagram on screen that many of the most important hotspots are further back upstream in agriculture, in forests, in mines, and so on, right around the world. And we see in those sorts of situations, there's increased complexity in how the supply chain operates, often including many hundreds or thousands of upstream suppliers for a single finished product. We also know that there's often reduced transparency to the retailer and to the tier one supplier and brand of what's happening, maybe multiple stages back in the supply chain. And there's often a misalignment between the sustainability data that's being gathered through existing upstream initiatives, and then what's required to meet the needs of retailers at the other end of the supply chain. And so what we see is that very often brands responding to our KPIs are only able to answer, unable to determine to some of those retailer-facing KPIs that ask about things that are happening in tier 2 or tier 3 or beyond. And often that's just simply because they're unable to get the right data in the right format at the right time. And so there's a real risk of duplicate effort alongside the existing sector-specific sustainability initiatives and also the other software tools and proprietary company initiatives that are out there. So we've now started a project to start to disaggregate, to break up some of our retailer-facing KPIs and figure out how relevant bits of that, the relevant questions, can be passed further back upstream to make that alignment across the value chain work much better. And we're partnering with a number of leading software companies to test the implementation of this, SupplyShift being one, but also with EcoVadis and ThinkStep and Tethys and others. And then in parallel, we are engaging with all of the leading sector-specific sustainability initiatives. So organizations like CDP, when it comes to measuring carbon and climate, the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, and the Stewardship Index, and the Cool Farm Alliance, and Field to Market when it comes to ag, and then the HIG Index and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition in the clothing and textile space, for example. And so across the IT piece and across these partnerships, we really think that's going to help us move forward to that ultimate objective where we have much better connectivity across the supply chain and much greater transparency across the supply chain. And ultimately, we have a vision where there's some sort of chain of custody data model that makes sure useful, actionable, consistent sustainability information gets in front of the key decision makers right along the value chain, so that they can all make smart decisions and engage their companies and their suppliers and customers in doing more on sustainability performance. So looking forward to the conversation. I'll stop there and hand back to Cheryl. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Euan. And we have our last presenter before the question and answer session. We have Jamie Barsimantov. He is the COO from SupplyShift. Jamie?
Hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. Pleasure to be on the line with everyone. Thanks to the other panelists for leading in. I'm happy to take up the rear here. I'll give a very short overview of what SupplyShift is and then really focus on how do we look at what the other speakers have said as far as emerging trends in the area of supply chain responsibility and supply chain measurement and metrics. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, what SupplyShift is, just so you know, what I'm talking about is it's a supply chain data network. It's a transparency platform. Slide above, please, if you don't mind. Back one. Works across any topic or industry for tracing back multiple tiers or for addressing tier 1. It's used with coffee farmers in Rwanda all the way to running SEDEX audits in the US and Europe and so on. Next slide. I'm not going to talk really about what SupplyShift does, nuts and bolts. Suffice to say that it helps with all the analytics and all the tracking and all the data collection that a company might need. We've been around for coming on 7 years now. We work with all the companies on the phone today, as well as with companies like Target and HP and Coca-Cola and Colgate, to address a really diverse and growing set of needs. So that's kind of where I'll jump into the big picture trends. Next slide, please. The first one is somewhat obvious, but there's something kind of special that we see happening. Transparency is becoming a business operating requirement, right? 5 years ago, this was optional and it was something to make you look good. Now it's becoming business as usual. And I know, I think probably on every panel I've heard recently, everyone talks about, BlackRock, the world's biggest investment company, saying that companies will need to monitor impact to remain relevant and attract investment. And that's just, it's transforming from transparency being something revolutionary and different to becoming a business operating requirement. Next click, please. And what we see there, keep going, sorry, too much animation there, is that, what people have been doing to date looks mostly at tier 1. The reach of current solutions really help most with that. But the scope of accountability and risk is well beyond that, down to farm level, through an unknown number of tiers sometimes. To even identify the source is a big challenge, but this is becoming business as usual. However, for every company, it looks different, right? You heard Wrangler and Campbell tell very different stories of the issues that are important to them and the frameworks and the tools they're using to get there. And so that makes a really complicated challenge for companies. So that's one thing we're seeing. Next trend, next slide, please, is that getting the information is a stumbling block, right? If we look at kind of a very caricaturized 1, 2, 3 of working on these issues, first you commit to change, right? There's a lot of engagement. I'm sure Roian and Niki and every other sustainability manager, director has gone through a lot to get the commitments from the companies, from the companies they work with to really be present and something that they're now, working diligently on. Click, please. The last stage of this is actually implementing the change, right? Engaging with suppliers, improving conditions, improving practices. It's a huge task, right? That is a huge task, and it's those 3 bullets do not cover anywhere nearly the enormity of what it takes to actually change the issues that we find. However, click again. What we see is that people get stuck in the middle. Knowing who's in the supply chain, knowing where the problems are, that often creates the inability to get to step 3. Click again. And more importantly is that becomes what you do, right? Finding out who, what, and where, kind of the time that takes overshadows step 3, which is really what we're supposed to be doing, right? And one more click. So then the big question that we ask when we're trying to say, how do we continue to serve the companies that we serve and serve more and more, is how do we shrink number 2, right? How do we really get the focus back on the change so that the folks in companies who need to work with this data have it at their fingertips and don't spend all their time just getting the data and analyzing it with no time left to figure out what to do next. So those are the 2 trends. What we do about that is a kind of a shift over the last year, maybe especially the last half a year, of working much more closely with our alliances. Next slide, please. We find that these standardized solutions, assessment mechanisms, consulting groups who are doing kind of replicable models to help companies collect certain types of data in the supply chain in a much more streamlined way. We have lots of partnerships. It tends to be the case that in a lot of our work, there is an expert consultant or industry group that has defined what the company is going to measure and what it means. And we found that we can spend a lot more of our effort automating those things and making them available to a wide range of users so that not every company needs to go through that painstaking work of defining what to measure, what it means. They can just start doing it immediately. Next slide, please. So that's what we call SupplyShift Essentials. SupplyShift Essentials is what are the essential measurement tools needed for a given topic. One of our recently launched Essentials programs is with the Sustainability Consortium for the 2018 Sustainability Index. We have a group of brands, including those on the line, where basically what Euan said is disaggregating those retailer to brand KPIs into their supply chain data components and having an automated off-the-shelf tool that any company can say, great, I am working on this topic. I load up my supplier list and I go. And the more suppliers see the same format and the same data, the more used to providing it they are, the more everyone can focus on making the change we want to see. So this is really exciting with TSC, but it's not the only Essentials program. We have 3 Essentials programs right now, with a couple more launching later this month. Next slide, please. One of our really close industry alliances is another example. This isn't just retailer-led. Bonsucro is the global platform in the sugarcane industry. We power their certification program, the chain of custody tracking, and then offering more tools to their members to address the types of things they need to do, one of which being rolling up information on field level sugarcane production to then report to TSC. So all these things connect to each other in the end. So the Essentials program we see is really critical for helping companies not get lost in the weeds and to address that growing trend for making this business as usual. Last slide, I guess, click one more time. But this doesn't really obviate the need for customized solutions, because there is a leading edge to all this where there are new issues and new ways of measuring them being developed. And we also need to hold those within SupplyShift to then make them Essentials programs down the road, because everyone shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. That's all I've got for slides, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Jamie, and Rowan, Niki, and Euan as well for your presentations. We've received a number of questions from the audience that I'll begin to go through, and I encourage the audience to continue to contribute questions as we go along here. So I'm going to begin with some questions for Rowan and Niki. There was some interest in learning about where the cost may come from implementing the supply chain assessment programs you talked about, and how you're justifying those costs internally. I don't know, Rowan, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the costs vary, I guess, depending upon how aggressive of an engagement you want to have. Naturally, I mean, we've taken an education approach, a tracking and measurement approach, and each of those subsequent steps has a cost associated with it. So to develop educational materials, to have those materials live on a web-based platform, and then the tracking and measurement piece, and engaging and getting our tool providers like SupplyShift for My Farms has a cost associated with it. But how do we justify? I think that looking towards just the changing demographic of consumer preferences, the changing consumer preferences by demographic, and just the way that we even look at the pressures from consumers in general. I mean, the way that we characterize it is how can we not invest in these tools, just from a risk standpoint. I think internally we used to look at, from a consumer insight standpoint in the relationship with consumers, we used to ask the question, would consumers pay more for a sustainable attribute? And then that question kind of evolved into, all things being equal for denim, fit, form, and function, would a consumer choose our brand over another brand, over competitors if it had a sustainable attribute? And now that question is evolving to a point where we're asking, if we don't do it, then and we're found out for not doing it and not managing against these risks, then consumers will outright reject the brand. And seeing that by 2030 that we're going to have more than the significant number of millennials that will be in the workforce, and the aspiring Generation Z right behind those guys, these are the types of conversations that are not just that are feeding into, is the ROI? It's not just simply an ROI discussion. That we're looking at this as the broader business drivers that lead us to a decision point to manage against the risks in our supply chain, which includes investing in the cost for education, tracking, and supplying with suppliers. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Niki, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, we use a lot of those same strategies as well, I will say. I mean, we're in the process right now of trying to get budget for implementing some new systems. So, one of the things that we're thinking about, I mean, we're this house of brands, right? So our consumer demographic is different per brand. So, your plum consumer is very different than your red and white Campbell soup consumer. So we're also looking at it from that perspective. You know, do we need to focus some of our efforts on some of those brands where the consumers care a little bit more about these things? One of the things that we are doing, though, that I'm really excited about is on the traceability piece. So understanding where our ingredients come from is very complicated, and internally we have a lot of systems that don't necessarily talk to one another. And as we've had a variety of acquisitions over the past few years, those companies have come with their own systems. So we have actually integrated budget into our overall IT project stream to implement a traceability system. So we know that as e-commerce comes to life and we need to be able to provide more information from that channel, that we also need to know where the ingredients come from, what's in the ingredients. So we've used it, you know, we've sold it that way internally, as it's, you know, it's a business need to be able to speak externally to the consumer.
Great, thanks. And Jamie, I wonder if you have any insight on this as well, because you do have a service that you're asking brands or retailers to pay for. How have you seen companies make the business or sustainability case to invest in the service you guys provide?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a big challenge, right? I think we see three angles on this that are all interwoven. The first and the most kind of basic and not super exciting is saving time, right? So you're drowning in all kinds of Excel sheets. You know you have to get this work done. You're not able to achieve it well. So measuring the time savings, showing an ROI on that is great. Probably not going to be the deciding factor, right? It's going to do some justification. The two other areas that we see this kind of the business saying, wow, I need this, is on the one hand, if you're a chief procurement officer, you want your vendor managers to have all the information they can at their fingertips on sustainability, on quality, on compliance, on price. I don't know any company that has that kind of visibility that they can be assured their vendor managers have all the information all in one place to make those good decisions. And that's really kind of bigger picture, the value that SupplyShift delivers is bringing that data all the way through to the vendor management process and decision-making process and integrating multiple data streams, not just the sustainability data, but collecting or feeding in through our API all kinds of data. And that makes a whole different justification within the company for better buying. The third one comes from marketing. Marketing spends a lot of time and money on reputation. And if there's a disaster that affects the reputation, they're going to spend a lot of money on expensive consultants to do damage control. So that's a pretty expensive risk. And so some of the drive, not necessarily the work to get the job done, but some of the drive and the justification often comes from kind of the marketing brand reputation side.
Great, thanks. So now I have a question for Euan. You had mentioned that you've been collecting data for several years, largely through the Walmart Sustainability Index. Where have there been improvements in scores and performance? And if you know, how have they come about?
Great, thank you. So we are a couple of weeks away from publishing our latest impact report that goes into much more detail than I'll be able to right now on the latest set of results from the end of 2017, but also for the first time we look back at 2016 and 2015 and start to draw out some of the specific trends. I think a few things I will say, maybe at a slightly higher level. Firstly, we still see huge variability across basically every single industry. So there's a group of companies who tend to be doing really pretty well, are often scoring in the 90 to 100% across most of the questions in a category. And then there's another group that are almost at the other end of the scale. and really have done very little and have fairly limited traceability and visibility back into their supply chain. What we are seeing in that profile is once a company makes the commitment and actually starts to go through the process of moving out of that bottom tier, they can actually relatively rapidly move up and get into that leading pack. And our assumption, we don't know this from the data, but our assumption is that's really around what it takes to manage sustainability. And if you have built the supplier relationships to manage carbon, for example, then those are the same supplier relationships you're going to need to manage worker rights or worker health and safety or water use or waste or whatever else it might be. And the same logic applies when it comes to internal systems and putting teams in place and so on. So we're seeing that trend. What we also see, and this really was the most interesting thing to me, is that the companies who have been reporting for multiple years, for whom we've got 3 years worth of data, they score highest, and they're the ones that have improved most over that time. So it says a couple of things to me. That firstly, it says that there is a track record in being able to show improvement over time, be able to implement and drive changes, and it does take multiple years because, as you know, we've heard from Campbell's and Wrangler, it's complicated. You can't just flick a switch. It's actually hard work, but it does yield results, and it's fantastic to be able to see those results coming through in the data. And then the second thing is the companies that have just got more involved maybe 2 years ago or even just last year, they aren't scoring as well, but we now know what it takes to get them up the curve, the sorts of things they need to put in place to improve their scores and catch up. And that gives us, and it gives all those companies, the to-do list for next year to go after the big sustainability improvements that we now know are technically possible, financially possible, and you can actually get out and get them done. And that's really what's getting me most excited from all of this.
Great, thank you. Now I have another question for both Roian and Niki. It kind of relates to the ideas of balancing accountability and scalability. So the questions that we received were, asking, how are you getting the data from your suppliers? Is it a self-audit? Are representatives from your organization going to some of the suppliers? And how do you ensure accountability and accuracy of that information? Roian, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. It is, I had a slide in there a little bit about the collaborative effort to get to the data. We don't do it alone. We liaise with our sourcing teams and our responsible sourcing teams both to identify, first step one is just which suppliers are we going after, right? And which are the key priority suppliers. That exercise alone can take some time to pull up the full list and then sort them by the total weight attribution to the product portfolio, because if you don't have to go after the small long tail of suppliers that were in there for sample runs or what have you, then don't do it. It's a lot of time and a lot of engagement a lot of time that can be saved by avoiding that sort of subset. But yeah, going in, I think there's a couple key points. One is really impressing upon the supplier about how their data will be treated confidentially, not shared with other suppliers, making sure that you have the right representative from the supplier. If you've got an account rep, just a sales rep who's not necessarily familiar with their job, not necessarily motivated, probably not the greatest person to respond to the questions in the survey, because there's some technical stuff in there. You almost have to encourage them to connect or liaise with other members of their team. That's one functionality of the SupplyShift software that we appreciated, was the ability to port a question over to someone else internally within their organization. So making sure they knew that functionality exists within the software, or even if you don't have the software, just encouraging that cross collaboration internally within the supplier's organization is kind of critical. But to the point about data validation and QC check, absolutely, that's a critical step after all of the information comes back in. And I remember there's a lot about just data outliers, looking at data outliers. I mean, we generally understand and know when data doesn't look right. And a great example is I once got a supplier that told me that they used 900 kWh per month in their factory. Wrong. It's very simply wrong. That's how much I use in my home, right? So there's no possible way they were using 900 kWh. Various different things of that nature. If there is a supplier that's reporting an incredible number of injuries at their location, one, that needs a data check, but that also needs something else. That needs a conversation. That needs roping back in the compliance team and actually asking, hey, does this concur with your understanding of the supplier? When was the last time we did an audit? Are you aware that they're reporting increased number of injuries? There is the possibility that people are going to try and cheat and share less information. But we feel that, when we spend the time with that early onboarding, the education, the why, the just all of that, that sort of grooming them to understand the importance of this initiative, that we actually think that people are responding pretty accurately. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't do it. A QC check for sure. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Niki. I don't have a lot to add to that because we use a very similar process. And one of the things that we did, as you saw on my slides, we narrowed it down to the ingredients that we're going to focus on. And in all reality, we've really been focused on like our top 5 agricultural ingredients and working hand in hand with those suppliers and those major suppliers. And yeah, you have to rely on them and hope that they'll be accountable to give you the right information. But in particular, we work a lot with our tomato suppliers, and we've been collecting that data over the past probably 5 or 6 years, and we can tell when there are discrepancies. So internally, we need to be able to understand that data as well.
Cheryl, you might be on mute. Cheryl, are you on mute?
Yes. No, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I apologize. My phone went out and I had to dial back in. So I missed, so Roian answered the question. Did Niki get a chance to as well?
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry about that. So that's terrific. And so I'll go to just a quick, we're going to try to do the last question for each panelist now. So just a question for Jamie. I guess as you think about how companies are implementing different surveys and questions, how do they balance custom questions and like the idea around standardized questions and any other like best practices you've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question. We invariably have the same conversation with almost every potential customer. They say, great, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. What do you have that I can use? Oh, we have all these things. Oh, thanks. I actually have my own survey. Can we do that instead? Sure. 3 months later, I get it now that if I do something standardized, this would have been easier and I would have spent less time thinking about this. So it really has to, having great standardized solutions available off the shelf and having more and more of them is the key to this challenge, while allowing companies through the platform to change questions, right? I want to take out those questions and add a few more. That's all possible in the platform. So the flexibility is key. But I think any company would prefer something off the shelf that suits their needs rather than reinventing the wheel.
Great, thanks. And for Euan, since your organization's offering key performance indicators that they could use, I guess, how do you recommend brands and manufacturers in particular leverage those tools, and what are the benefits that you have heard companies get from that?
Great, thanks. Well, I guess Jamie just touched on a lot of the benefits of taking a standardized approach. Of course, it's easier for companies not to need to develop something themselves. And of course, if their suppliers are already reporting to other corporate customers, then we save everyone a load of survey fatigue through that standardization. So it's something we really encourage. And companies can come direct to us and pick up our work, or go through organizations like SupplyShift through the sorts of projects Jamie alluded to, and get involved that way.
Great, thanks. And Roian and Niki, if you have any key insights from the work that you have been doing in collecting information through your supply chains and recommendations you might have for others. Roian, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one recommendation would be to really clearly set up, as I shared, the guidance, the onboarding documentation with the suppliers, but also just to make sure that there's sort of the functionality that they need. Really make sure that the question that we're asking translates well. So, for example, if you're asking a question about, in our world, yardage and fabric, having a question toggle or drop down, or being specific on the widths of fabrics, because it matters the difference of widths of fabric. Every supplier might have a different machine that creates a different width of fabric. So in that particular case, having the flexibility in the questions, and having the insight to have that flexibility ahead of time, so you're not finding yourself collecting data with the wrong units of measure, right? And this can cause a lot of consternation on the computation. It can cause a lot of challenges on having to go back and have to verify if they didn't use a measure of unit that you're familiar with, or that was a part of a drop down. So just all that to be said is make sure that the questions being utilized, the KPIs, are in the best configuration that it's accessible by supplier.
Sure, and this is Niki. The only thing that I would add is you really define your priorities and your focus areas, and do it in bite-sized pieces. And again, be clear with your suppliers and make it simple for them. As one of the recipients as a supplier, it's often challenging when we get multiple questionnaires and surveys, and they're asking for 100 different things and different measurements. So the more concise and simple you can make it for your suppliers, the more likely they will be to engage with you.
Yeah, well, with that, we're at time, and I want to thank each of our presenters today, Roian, Atwood, Niki King, Euan Murray, and Jamie Barsimantov. Thanks so much, all of you, and our audience for providing questions. And that's the end of our webinar today.